Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue on adding in different media assets, and today I'm going to teach you how to bring in a podcast into your homepage. The first thing you need to do when you want to bring in a podcast to your home screen is to create the podcast. To do that, you want to go to Media Assets and go to Music. You want to go to music. Don't go to podcast first. Go to music. We have to create a new music album or a audio album. To do that, just click on album tab and click add album, and we're going to name it whatever your podcast is. I'm just going to call it podcast. Click create. Now it's open up the podcast description just like creating an album, but this is your audio files that you're going to upload that's a part of your podcast. Instead of uploading music albums, we're uploading podcast episodes, still MP3s for those who are using audio only. So just like the music album, we have to first create the thumbnails or the podcast artwork. We've created some artwork already for the podcast, so we're just going to go straight to that. And we're going to just simply do this process 3 times, bringing this podcast artwork into our NOWCAST dashboard. And the final one, click apply. I'm going to double click on that artwork and now have all 3 podcast covers. Again, this is whatever you want it to be, but this is just for our example. This is our podcast audio cover. Click save and then go ahead and click publish so we can bring it into our mobile app homepage. Now we have to bring in the MP3 episode audio files into your podcast. To do that, we want to just go back to music, and now we're just going to upload the individual MP3 episodes. I'm just going to click on the drag and drop and go to my podcast episode 1. Click OK. And now this episode 1 in there, I'm going to title it podcast episode 1. And now I'm going to add the artwork. I'm just going to call it podcast audio. I'm going to click publish, and that is done. Save and go back, and I'm going to bring in my second episode. Click here, episode 2. I'm going to call this podcast episode 2. Same thing, I'm going to add the same artwork. Again, you can add different artwork for each podcast episode. That's your complete choice. Don't forget to click published. Click back, and then I'm going to do the final episode 3. Click OK, open, and I'm going to name this podcast episode number 3. And you can of course have a title, subtitle, or if you want to have that. Click appearance again, just bring in the artwork. And now once all 3 artworks are in place, click published, and I'm just going to click the back button, and as you can see I have episode 1, 2, and 3 all under songs. Now I'm going to go back to album, and I'm going to bring in those 3 episodes inside my podcast audio. And there you go. Click on add item, click episode 1, episode 2, and episode 3. Click apply, and all 3 are now listed. When I click save, now you can see they're all published and they're now all listed in my podcast list. You can interchange the order if you like, just by simply grabbing it and just changing the order. Episode 1, 2, and 3. Now that I have my episodes in place inside my audio podcast album, now I'm going to go to podcast, and from here I'm going to create the podcast itself. that I'm going to be sending to the different podcast websites like Spotify or Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, etc. So I'm just going to name it podcast title, click create, and now whatever summary you can have, whatever description, your description goes here. Whatever you want that to say, that's just, you want to copy and paste, or however you want to explain your podcast, right? You want to click the category. Let's go, just click news. Lecturer could be whoever you need it to be. And now the ownership verification email is very important. All right, you don't want to use the email that you're going to use to log into your different accounts. So they use this to verify you are the owner of this podcast. So make sure that this is accurate. So whatever email that you use to log into, like let's say Google Podcast, needs to be the same thing here. Now when you get to content, this is where you're going to select your podcast music audio. Click here, and you have the option for video series, a folder like your video on demand folder. But what we did, we created an album or music or audio only podcast. Okay, so we're going to just select podcast audio, click apply, and it brings that entire podcast audio, episode 1, 2, and 3 inside my podcast. Here I can just change the image. I can just, whatever image you want it to be, I'm going to just select podcast audio. I'm going to click published and save. Now you notice where it says podcast feed, it is not highlighted. So what we have to do, we got to click generate podcast feed. Now the podcast feed URL has been created. I'm going to copy that, and now I'm going to take this URL to all of the sites where I want my podcast to be published to. And we're going to use Google Podcasts as an example. All you have to do, again, this is the same process, a similar process that you would do for Spotify or Apple Podcast or Google Podcasts, or there's so many different podcast platforms out there. But you want to go, in this case, we're using Google Podcast Manager. Search Google Podcast Manager, log in. If you don't have an account, create one, and it brings you to your dashboard here. We're going to now bring our NOWCAST podcast into the Google Podcast Manager. Again, you would do the same process for all of the several different podcast platforms that are out there. Right now, we're going to just click Add Show, and then we're going to paste that URL that we just copied from our NOWCAST podcast. We're going to paste it there. It's an RSS feed. We're going to click Next. And as you can see, it's automatically registering your NOWCAST podcast artwork. It tells you the episode. There's episode 1, episode 2, and episode 3. Right? And there's our description, our crazy description, and our crazy podcast title. Right? We're just going to click next step, and it's now going to verify that this is our podcast using the email that is in our NOWCAST platform. Right? Here it is. And we're just going to click submit, and there you go. We have submitted our podcast for review of the Google Podcast. Now it's in Google's hands, but it's that simple to add your podcast to to several different podcast platforms. And the cool thing about this is you only have to manage your podcast from one place, because every time you add a new audio episode or video episode to your podcast, it will automatically be added to every place you've placed that that RSS feed that you generated from NOWCAST dashboard. Now let's bring this podcast into our mobile app. To do that, we're going to now go back to apps, and we're just going to click add item. And from here, we're going to just simply click album, and there's my podcast under album. Click podcast, click apply, and I've successfully brought in my podcast audio to my homepage of my mobile app. Don't forget to hit save, and that's it. You are done. You have successfully brought in your podcast audio into your homepage. And so now every time when someone clicks on your podcast button on your mobile app, it will direct them to all of your audio podcasts. Don't forget, you can use video as well to be a part of your podcast. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something today. Continue to watch the videos as we continue to add more media assets inside our mobile app.